The mysterious cry for help. Hook. 800 words. The galaxy was calm. Too calm. In the vast stretches of space, millions of worlds spun silently, each with its own stories, its own struggles. The stars blinked softly in the endless night, and the hum of interstellar travel echoed in the distance. Yet, in the quiet corners of the universe, something had begun to stir. It was faint at first, barely a whisper in the vast silence of space. A signal, a cry for help, buried deep within the static of a dying frequency. No one noticed at first. It was just another piece of background noise, lost among the hundreds of signals traveling through the void. But then, it came again. The message was short, simple, direct, and it sent a chill through every species that intercepted it. We are under attack. Please, send aid. We can't hold much longer. A cry from a planet far on the edge of the galaxy, where few dared to venture. The message wasn't anything special, but there was something in the desperation of it that caught the attention of those who were watching. Whoever sent it was on the brink of losing everything. The first few civilizations that picked up the signal dismissed it. Just another desperate plea from a dying world. They said, "There's nothing to be done." But it wasn't long before more systems started picking up the same message, each one slightly more desperate than the last. The tone of the transmission grew more frantic with each repeat. The planets that received the messages could only watch in growing horror as they picked up on something even more disturbing. It wasn't just a cry for help anymore. It was a warning. The systems closest to the distressed planet were the first to send out scouts. What they found was beyond anyone's imagination. Entire cities were reduced to ruins, once thriving civilizations now reduced to smoking craters. And worse, the source of the destruction was something no one had ever seen before. Something ancient, something terrifying. It was not just a war. This wasn't a fight between alien species over resources or territory. No, this was something far darker. The attacking force was like nothing the galaxy had ever encountered. The scouts reported strange, shadowy figures, massive in size, with powers beyond comprehension. They could control elements, tear through walls of solid rock like paper, and make entire fleets of ships disappear without a trace. As more reports came in, the truth became undeniable. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was spreading. The destructive force was moving across the galaxy, wiping out worlds, one by one, without mercy or warning. Across the galaxy, fear began to take root. Governments, once proud and strong, grew silent. Diplomats whispered behind closed doors. Species that had never considered each other allies now began to wonder if they could unite. Could they defeat this unknown enemy? Could anyone? But there was one thing that even the darkest of enemies feared. The Deathworlders. They were legends, stories told in whispers across the stars. The fiercest warriors the galaxy had ever known. Deathworlders had survived and conquered on planets where no one else could. Their worlds were violent, deadly, and hostile. The creatures that lived there were savage, and only the strongest survived. It was said that Deathworlders thrived in environments that would destroy most other species. If any race was capable of fighting an enemy like this, it would be them. And so the call was sent. A quiet, simple message, much like the first one that had been heard across the galaxy. This time, it was sent directly to the Deathworlders. No one else had the strength to fight this threat. No one else had the will to endure the horrors that were coming. We need your help. The galaxy is falling apart. The invaders are too strong. Only you can stop them. The message was sent, and the waiting began. The leaders of the Deathworlders, ancient and respected, deliberated in silence. They did not rush to action. They never did. The galaxy had often called on them, and more often than not, they had ignored the cries for help. They only intervened when it was absolutely necessary. But this time, something was different. They felt it. The weight of the situation pressed down on them. What kind of enemy would cause such devastation? What could possibly be powerful enough to make even the Deathworlders hesitate? The silence in the council chambers stretched on. For a moment, there was nothing but the soft hum of machinery and the weight of history in the air. Then the leader of the Deathworlders spoke, a figure whose very presence commanded attention, whose voice could shake the stars. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of 1,000 battles. "We will answer the call." And so, the galaxy waited. In every corner of space, life continued, ships traveled, trade continued, and civilizations carried on with their daily routines. But now, the universe held its breath. The Deathworlders were coming. The galaxy's greatest hope and its last defense had awoken. As they prepared to set out, the very air seemed to hum with anticipation. The unknown enemy had made its move, and now it was time for the Deathworlders to rise to the challenge. Would they be enough? Would their strength be enough to stop the unstoppable? The galaxy was about to find out. And so, the universe trembled. The Deathworlders' arrival. 800 words. The Deathworlders had answered the call. The silence of space was broken by the roar of their ships as they pierced through the stars. Massive, sleek, and built for war, their ships were a symbol of fear and respect across the galaxy. No species had ever dared challenge them directly, and it was said that the galaxy's most advanced fleets would crumble before the Deathworlders' might. But this was not just another battle. The message, simple yet chilling, had reached their leaders, and now they were coming. They were not just answering a distress call. They were preparing for a fight that would test even their legendary strength. The first of the Deathworlder ships emerged from the depths of space, their engines glowing brightly against the black void. As they approached the distress signal source, they encountered a scene of devastation that sent shivers through even their battle-hardened hearts. The alien planet was nothing like the reports had described. Entire continents were reduced to barren wastelands. Massive craters marked the landscape where cities once stood. The sky, once a brilliant blue, was now an eerie shade of red, as though the planet itself was bleeding. Smoke rose from the shattered cities, and strange tremors shook the surface. Something dark had already taken hold. As the Deathworlders landed, their boots hit the cracked surface of the alien world with a solid thud. They had been to many planets before, but this one felt different. The air was thick with fear, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of untold destruction. The planet was dying, and the Deathworlders were the only ones who could save it. Their leader, a towering figure known as Commander Varnak, stepped forward first. His armor was battered from years of endless battle, but it still gleamed with a fierce, unyielding light. Varnak's eyes scanned the horizon, taking in the landscape with the calm of a warrior who had seen the worst the galaxy had to offer. "We're too late," one of his officers muttered from behind him. "The planet's already lost." Varnak didn't answer immediately. He only nodded, his gaze never leaving the horizon. There was something unsettling about this place, something that gnawed at him, a sense of wrongness that he couldn't shake. The signal had said they were under attack, but this devastation seemed different. It felt more like an aftermath, like the calm after the storm. "We don't know that for sure," Varnak said finally, his voice low but firm. "We won't know until we see it for ourselves." They moved forward as a unit, their weapons raised and ready. As they walked through the wasteland, the remains of the planet's inhabitants began to appear, alien species that had once thrived here, now reduced to lifeless husks. Some had been burnt to ashes, others torn apart in ways that seemed too brutal even for the Deathworlders to comprehend. "Something did this," one of the soldiers said, his voice cracking. But what could be so powerful? The team kept moving, cautious but determined. They reached a large, abandoned city on the outskirts of what had once been a thriving metropolis. The buildings were half collapsed, their walls torn open like paper. Whatever had attacked this world hadn't just wiped out the population, it had obliterated everything. Suddenly, there was a noise, a sound so faint at first that it could have been mistaken for the wind. But then it grew louder, a low guttural growl that seemed to come from deep beneath the surface of the planet. It reverberated through the ground, shaking the Deathworlders to their core. It was unlike any noise they had ever heard before. This was not the sound of a conventional weapon or the roar of an enemy battle cry. This was something ancient. "Stay alert," Varnak ordered, his voice cold and steady. "We're not alone." The sound grew louder still, echoing across the empty streets like a warning, or perhaps a promise. Whatever it was, the Deathworlders knew it was not good. They had seen horrors in their time, beasts that could tear through entire armies, ancient creatures whose very presence could warp reality. But this was different. The air around them felt charged, like the planet itself was holding its breath. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the growling stopped. A thick silence fell over the group, heavy with anticipation. "Get ready," Varnak whispered. In that moment, the ground trembled beneath their feet. A shockwave, too powerful to ignore, rippled through the city. The Deathworlders braced themselves, their muscles tensing in unison as the earth shook violently beneath them. From the darkness, shapes began to emerge, shadows moving swiftly through the dust, like phantoms from another world. Varnak's hand gripped his weapon tighter. These weren't just enemies. They were something worse. The darkness, the silence, the crushing pressure of the air. This wasn't just a planet under siege. This was a world that had been forsaken, and whatever had come to take it was something the Deathworlders had never encountered before. They weren't prepared for this. But the Deathworlders didn't retreat. They didn't fear the unknown. They were warriors, forged in the fires of battle. And when the galaxy called for help, they would rise to the challenge, no matter the odds, no matter the enemy. "We fight now," Varnak said, his voice ringing with authority. "For this planet, for every world that could fall next." And with that, the Deathworlders began their march into the unknown, ready to face whatever waited for them in the dark corners of the galaxy. The true battle had only just begun. The horrors beneath, 800 words. The ground trembled beneath their boots as the Deathworlders advanced into the abandoned city. The eerie silence that had fallen after the growl seemed unnatural, unnervingly still, like the calm before a storm. The once proud alien city, now shattered and desolate, stretched out before them. Towering, half-destroyed buildings loomed like forgotten giants, their windows shattered, their streets empty but for the eerie dust and debris that scattered with every step. Something was lurking just beneath the surface. The growl, they now realized, wasn't just a noise. It was a warning. A sound that had been carried through the very bones of the planet. A call from deep within its core. The tremor they had felt wasn't just from an attack. It was something else. Something ancient. Something that had been lying dormant for far too long. Varnak, leader of the Deathworlders, surveyed the city with narrowed eyes. His heart was still pounding from the shockwave they had felt, but his instincts, honed through countless battles, told him that the real battle had not yet begun. "Stay sharp," he commanded in a low voice, his voice cutting through the thick atmosphere. "Whatever's out there is waiting for us." His warriors moved in tight formation, each one alert and on edge. They had faced many challenges before, from vicious alien species to monstrous creatures. But this was different. This felt wrong. Their enemy wasn't just an army. They were something more insidious, more powerful. "Commander," one of the soldiers called from the rear. "There's something here. Something. Alive." The group froze. Their weapons, designed for war, were held tight in their hands, ready to strike at anything that moved. The soldier who had spoken looked down at his feet. A deep crack had appeared in the ground, splitting open like a wound, revealing a glowing red light from below. The crack widened with a low, grinding noise, the sound vibrating through the bones of the Deathworlders, making their hairs stand on end. Something was rising from beneath the surface. The Deathworlders watched in silence as the ground cracked further. And then, from the depths of the fissure, something began to emerge. First, it was just a shadow, dark and formless. But then it solidified, a towering figure of nightmarish proportions. Its shape was angular and grotesque, with long, sharp appendages that seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if they were made of darkness itself. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with a sickly, pale light, and its mouth twisted into a grin that revealed rows of jagged teeth. The Deathworlders stepped back, instinctively raising their weapons. But before they could fire, another form emerged from the ground, then another and another. Soon, the street was filled with these creatures, their figures monstrous and menacing, their forms shifting like smoke. "What are they?" one of the soldiers muttered, his voice trembling for the first time. "They're not from this planet," Varnak said, his voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. "But they're not entirely alien, either." The creatures didn't move at first, their unnerving, glowing eyes fixed on the group of Deathworlders. The silence between them stretched on, thick and suffocating, as if the very air around them was holding its breath. Then, as if sensing their hesitation, the first creature lunged. It moved too fast for the Deathworlders to react, its body seeming to blur as it shot toward them. Its claws outstretched. The warriors fired immediately, their weapons sending bright bursts of energy into the creature. But the blasts seemed to have no effect. The energy passed through its form like it was nothing more than smoke. Varnak's eyes widened in realization. "They're phasing through our weapons. We need a different approach." The Deathworlders quickly adjusted their tactics, firing in rapid succession, hoping to hit something solid, anything that could stop this relentless assault. But the creatures were everywhere now, swarming, circling, slithering through cracks in the ground, their unnatural bodies twisting and shifting in ways that defied the laws of physics. They were unlike anything the Deathworlders had ever faced. With a shrill, bone-chilling screech, the first creature lunged again, this time at Varnak himself. He raised his arm just in time, meeting the creature head-on with his massive, energy-charged blade. The blade sliced through the air, cutting into the creature's body, but to his surprise, it didn't stop. Instead, the creature seemed to absorb the blow, its form shifting once more, reforming as if the damage had never been done. "These things are indestructible," one of the soldiers shouted, barely managing to dodge another strike from one of the creatures. Varnak gritted his teeth. He had never encountered anything that couldn't be killed or destroyed, not until now. "We need to move," Varnak commanded, his voice urgent. "We can't take them down here. We need to find their source." The Deathworlders fought valiantly, but they were overwhelmed. The creatures swarmed them, and for the first time in their long, brutal history, the Deathworlders found themselves in a position they had never been in before, on the defensive. Varnak took one last look around, his heart pounding. The enemy was everywhere, but there was something more he had to understand. These creatures were too organized, too coordinated. They weren't just attacking, they were hurting them. The Deathworlders had stumbled into something far worse than they could have imagined. The creatures weren't the main threat. They were just the beginning. From the ground beneath them, the planet seemed to shudder, as though it was alive. And the Deathworlders were just pawns in a much larger, far darker game. "Fall back," Varnak shouted. "We need to get out of here, now." But as they retreated, the shadows only seemed to grow darker. And deep beneath the surface of the planet, the true horror was waiting. The heart of the nightmare, 800 words. The Deathworlders moved quickly, but the creatures seemed to follow them with an unnatural persistence. They weren't just chasing them, they were hurting them. For every step the Deathworlders took, the ground seemed to crack open, sending more of the grotesque, shifting forms toward them. It was as if the planet itself had turned against them, pushing them deeper into its heart, where something far worse waited. Commander Varnak knew they needed to find the source of these creatures, and fast. If they didn't, there would be no way to fight back. The creatures weren't just an enemy. They were a symptom of something far larger, something far more terrifying. "Stay close," Varnak barked, his voice sharp through the comms. "We need to find shelter, somewhere we can regroup." The Deathworlders made their way through the wreckage of the alien city, their weapons raised and ready. Their footsteps echoed through the desolate streets, only the sound of their boots hitting the cracked pavement breaking the heavy silence. They turned a corner and found what they were looking for, a building that had withstood the destruction, a makeshift shelter. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The Deathworlders filed in quickly, shutting the door behind them. The creatures outside began to gather once more, their shadowy figures pressing against the windows, their eyes glowing eerily in the dark. "We can't stay here long," Varnak said, his voice low and grim. "These things won't stop until they've driven us into the planet's core." The soldiers, though battle-hardened, couldn't suppress the unease creeping up their spines. No enemy they had ever fought had been like this. These creatures weren't just mindless beasts. They were intelligent, and their behavior was calculated. "We need to understand what's causing this," Varnak continued. "We need to go deeper." The group nodded in unison. The planet's tremors hadn't stopped, and the sense of something massive and ancient stirring beneath their feet had only grown stronger. Whatever was causing this disturbance was not a simple invader. It was a force of nature itself, something as old as the stars. "We move in an hour," Varnak ordered. "Prepare yourselves. Whatever's down there, we need to be ready." As they prepared to venture into the depths of the planet, the Deathworlders couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. They had seen too much of war to mistake the signs. This wasn't an ordinary battle. This was a battle for survival. And if they failed, the galaxy would tremble in its wake. The hour passed in tense silence. No one spoke. Every soldier knew what was at stake, and every warrior felt the weight of the decision they were about to make. They weren't just fighting for a dying planet anymore. They were fighting for the future of countless worlds, and they couldn't afford to fail. Varnak led the way, his massive frame cutting through the dark tunnels that stretched beneath the city. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the planet itself was holding its breath, waiting. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls of the tunnel seemed to pulse, alive with some strange energy, and the sound of distant guttural growls echoed from every direction. "Stay close," Varnak said quietly. "We're getting closer." The Deathworlders moved in a tight formation, their weapons at the ready. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat, every flicker of light a potential trap. They could feel the tremors beneath their feet growing stronger, as though something huge was moving beneath the surface. And then, the tunnel opened up into a vast cavern. The sight that greeted them was nothing short of horrifying. At the center of the cavern, a massive, pulsing mass of dark energy hovered in midair, its form constantly shifting, writhing as if alive. The air around it crackled with unnatural energy, and the Deathworlders could feel their bodies tingle with the raw power emanating from it. It was as if the planet itself had given birth to this dark force, this malevolent presence that was now consuming everything in its path. The creatures they had seen earlier weren't just mindless attacks, they were its protectors. The real enemy, the source of all this devastation, was right in front of them. Varnak stared at the mass in horror, his mind racing. They had to destroy it. But how? It was beyond anything they had encountered before. This wasn't a war they could win with brute force alone. This was something far older, far more powerful. "It's feeding off the planet," one of the soldiers murmured, his voice trembling. "It's draining the life from the world itself." Varnak nodded grimly. "And if we don't stop it, it will spread. To every planet, to every star system. We're not just fighting for this world anymore. We're fighting for the entire galaxy." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. The odds had never been worse, and the enemy had never been more insurmountable. But the Deathworlders weren't known for retreating in the face of overwhelming odds. They were known for fighting, for surviving. And if this was the challenge the universe had set before them, then they would face it head-on. Varnak raised his weapon and took a step forward. We finish this together. The Deathworlders moved as one, their steps synchronized, their weapons primed. Whatever horrors awaited them in this heart of darkness, they would face it with the strength of 1,000 warriors. The battle for the galaxy had begun, and there was no turning back. The cavern was suffocating, its air thick with the smell of decay and raw, unnatural energy. The Deathworlders stood at the threshold, staring at the pulsating mass of darkness at the center of the vast expanse. The energy radiating from it was oppressive, almost tangible, and the crackling sounds of power made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. This wasn't just an enemy. They were standing before something that defied all understanding. Varnak's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene. The mass of darkness at the center of the cavern was unlike anything they had ever encountered, its shape constantly shifting, swirling in ways that seemed impossible, like it was alive, breathing, feeding off the planet itself. It had to be the source of everything. The growls, the creatures, the tremors. But how? How had it come to exist? And more importantly, how could they stop it? "We need a plan," Varnak muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The Deathworlders had fought battles across the galaxy, but nothing like this. No tactics, no weapons, no force they could muster seemed capable of taking on something like this. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Commander," one of the soldiers called, his voice tight with anxiety. "Look." Varnak followed the soldier's gaze. The shifting mass seemed to grow more intense, its pulsations now creating waves in the air, distorting the surroundings. The ground beneath their feet trembled more violently, sending cracks running through the cavern floor. The Deathworlders' knees wobbled as the tremors hit, their grip on their weapons tightening. Then, from the very heart of the mass, something began to emerge. A shape, dark and formless, slowly materialized, larger than anything they had imagined. It seemed to absorb the surrounding darkness, growing as it emerged. It was something beyond comprehension, something that no one could describe in mere words. The figure stretched upward, towering over them, its silhouette bending and twisting in an unnatural way. The soldiers instinctively took a step back, their weapons raised in defense. But it was too late. The shape suddenly lunged forward, and a wave of energy slammed into them, knocking them off their feet. The shockwave was so powerful that it reverberated in their bones, sending them sprawling across the cavern floor. Varnak cursed as he scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight against something ancient, something beyond their understanding. "Fall back," Varnak roared, but it was already too late. The creatures, the same ones that had been swarming the city above, now poured into the cavern, pouring out of the cracks in the ground like a flood. They were relentless, their eyes glowing with a maddening intensity, their bodies moving with disturbing speed and precision. The Deathworlders fought back, but it was as if their weapons had no effect. The creatures shifted and phased through their attacks as if they were nothing more than shadows. Every strike, every blast, seemed to only fuel the creatures further. They were being overwhelmed. "We can't fight them like this," one of the soldiers shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Varnak's eyes burned with determination. "We fight or we die," he growled. "Push forward. Keep moving." They pushed ahead, making their way toward the heart of the swirling dark mass. Every step they took felt heavier, as if the very air around them was trying to drag them down. But Varnak refused to stop. They couldn't fail now. Too many lives depended on them. Too many worlds would burn if they did. As they neared the center, the air became suffocating. The oppressive energy threatened to tear at their very souls. But Varnak could feel something else, something faint, like a pulse, a heartbeat deep within the mass. It was there. It was the source. "This is it," Varnak shouted. "We're almost there." The Deathworlders surged forward, their weapons crackling with energy, their bodies pushing through the oppressive atmosphere. The creatures continued to swarm them, but they fought with everything they had, every last ounce of strength and skill. They reached the mass, and it felt like the very fabric of reality was bending around them. Varnek's heart raced as he looked up at the pulsating center. He could feel it now, this dark power, this presence that had awakened and now sought to consume everything. It was feeding on the planet, and it was feeding on their fear. He had to end this. Focus fire on the center. Varnek yelled. We take it down now. The Deathworlders aimed their weapons at the core, every shot calculated, every blast directed at the pulsating center. Their energy weapons flared to life, and the ground shook as each shot connected with the mass. For a moment, it seemed like nothing was happening. The shots just disappeared into the shifting darkness. Then suddenly, there was a violent explosion. The air split with a deafening roar as the mass of darkness was hit, the force of the blast shaking the cavern to its very core. The Deathworlders were thrown back, their bodies crashing against the walls as the shockwave tore through the cavern. When the dust cleared, the mass had receded slightly, but it was far from defeated. It was angry now, its pulsing energy surging with violent intensity. The creatures that had been swarming them seemed to grow even more frenzied, their movements erratic as if they were reacting to the energy. It's not enough, one of the soldiers shouted. Varnek gritted his teeth, his mind racing. The first blast had wounded it, but it wasn't finished. It was still alive, still feeding. There's more to this, he muttered. We need to find the core, its heart. That's where its power comes from. We destroy that, and the rest will fall. But before he could say more, the ground shook violently again. The creatures charged, closing in on them from all sides, forcing the Deathworlders to focus on survival. Find the core, Varnek roared, before it's too late. But with every passing second, the weight of the situation pressed down harder on them. The creatures, the energy, the shifting darkness. They were trapped, and if they didn't destroy the heart of the nightmare, the galaxy itself would fall. The Deathworlders stood on the edge of the abyss, their weapons firing non-stop as the creatures swarmed, pouring from the cracks in the cavern like a tidal wave of destruction. The once unfathomable dark mass had only grown stronger, pulsing with violent energy, its grip on the planet tightening as though it was feeding on the chaos itself. The ground beneath their boots trembled with each passing moment, each violent shake a reminder that the galaxy was hanging by a thread. The creatures pressed closer, their eyes glowing with an unholy intensity. Every time a Deathworlder fired a shot, the creatures adapted, dodging, shifting their forms with unnatural speed. No matter how many they cut down, it was never enough. Varnek's mind raced. The initial blast had wounded the mass of darkness, but that was all. They hadn't dealt the killing blow. The energy from the planet's core seemed to be feeding into it, fueling it. They needed to find its heart, the true source of its power, but time was running out. If they didn't act now, they would be overwhelmed. Commander, one of his soldiers, Sergeant Thorne, shouted over the noise of battle. His voice was strained, breathless. We need to push through. We can't hold them off much longer. Varnek's eyes locked on the mass. It seemed to sense their desperation, its pulse quickening, the air around them growing hotter and thicker. The darkness was closing in, and they were running out of options. The creatures had started circling them, sensing that the Deathworlders were weaker now. A few of their comrades were injured, their energy shields flickering out of existence with every blow. If they didn't destroy the core soon, the planet would collapse around them, taking them all with it. Varnek clenched his fists. No, we finish this here. They had no choice. They were in it now. There was no retreat, no escape. The fate of an entire galaxy rested in their hands, and if they failed, the darkness would spread like a plague across the stars. The universe would fall. Everyone, focus on the center, Varnek ordered, Voice firm. No distractions. We're ending this, right here, right now. The Deathworlders moved as one, stepping into formation with practiced ease. Their weapons crackled with energy as they readied their final assault. Varnak felt the weight of every weapon in his hands, each one carrying the hope of a galaxy, the lives of billions riding on their success. The creatures closed in faster, but this time, the Deathworlders fought back with a fury unmatched by anything before. The pulse of the dark mass had intensified, but so had the resolve of the soldiers. They had fought too many battles, lost too many comrades, to let this be the end. They couldn't afford to lose. Fire everything, Varnak shouted. The first volley of shots collided with the mass. The air seemed to crack as the energy hit. The cavern shook violently, dust and debris falling from the ceiling as the force of their firepower struck at the heart of the dark mass. But the mass didn't give up. It writhed in agony, then retaliated with an explosive wave of energy that sent several of the Deathworlders flying back. But they weren't done. They pressed forward again, weapons blazing. A soldier to the left, Sergeant Baran, shouted as his shield crackled out, but he didn't flinch. He tossed a grenade straight into the heart of the mass, and the explosion sent another shockwave through the cavern. The darkness screamed, a deafening, unnatural sound that seemed to shake the very air. But it still wasn't enough. We need to hit it directly. Varnak shouted through the chaos, realizing that their attacks were just scratching the surface. The heart of the darkness had to be deeper within, and they needed to find it now. Baran, despite his shield going down, kept firing his weapon, desperately laying down cover. Varnak dashed forward, his squad close behind. Each step seemed heavier, like the very ground beneath them was fighting against them, but they pressed on, determined to find the core and end it. And then, through the chaos, Varnak saw it, a glowing orb barely visible beneath the swirling mass of darkness. He could feel its power radiating, a sickening pull on everything around it. This was it. This was the heart of the nightmare. Over here, Varnak roared, pointing toward the orb. We hit that. We end it. With no hesitation, the Deathworlders turned and ran toward the orb, their weapons trained on it. The mass of darkness reacted almost instantly, its tendrils reaching out to stop them, but it was too late. Varnak leaped forward, his heavy rifle raised. He fired directly at the orb, unleashing everything he had. The shot struck the core, and then the world seemed to stand still. The air crackled with energy as the orb exploded with a force that sent shockwaves rippling through the cavern. The dark mass shuddered, its form beginning to collapse in on itself. The creatures that had been swarming them stopped mid-attack, their bodies spasming as if they, too, were being torn apart by the explosion. And then silence. Varnak stood there, panting, watching as the energy dissipated. The pulsating mass was gone, its dark presence vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The creatures lay still, their bodies disintegrating into dust, their existence erased by the collapse of the core. It was over. They had won. But as Varnak looked around at the bodies of his fallen comrades, a heavy weight settled in his chest. They had succeeded, but at what cost? How many had they lost? How many lives had been sacrificed to save a galaxy? The Deathworlders had completed their mission, but the victory felt hollow. Still, as Varnak stood amidst the remains of the darkness, he knew one thing for certain: they had protected the galaxy, and that was a victory worth every sacrifice. The fight had been won, but the war for the universe would continue. And when the galaxy called again, the Deathworlders would rise once more. The cavern was eerily silent now. The oppressive energy that had once filled the air had dissipated, leaving behind an unsettling calm. The Deathworlders stood in the aftermath of the battle, their breathing heavy, their bodies battered and bruised. They had won, but the cost had been high, too high. Varnak surveyed the scene. His comrades, his soldiers, had fought like legends, each one giving everything they had to save the galaxy. But as he looked at the fallen bodies, the lifeless forms of those who had given their last breath in the battle. He couldn't help but feel the weight of their sacrifice. The planet had been saved. The dark mass that had threatened to swallow everything was gone. The creatures that had plagued the world were reduced to dust. But victory felt bittersweet. How many did we lose? Thorn's voice broke through the silence, his words thick with emotion. He stood next to Varnak, his eyes scanning the battlefield. Varnak swallowed hard, his voice low. Too many. The battle had been brutal, the loss of life immense. Every soldier in the Deathworlders squad had fought with valor, but not all had survived. Some had fallen to the creatures. Others had been caught in the explosion when the core had finally been destroyed. The blood of their comrades stained the ground, a constant reminder of the price they had paid. But despite the overwhelming grief, Varnak couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. The Deathworlders had faced something that no one had ever encountered before, an entity so dark and powerful that it threatened to consume an entire galaxy. And they had stopped it. They had risen to the challenge, fought with everything they had, and saved countless lives in the process. He turned to his squad, his gaze steady. We did it. We saved the galaxy. The soldiers around him nodded grimly. They knew the cost. They knew the sacrifices made, but in their hearts, they understood the gravity of what they had accomplished. They had faced down the abyss and emerged victorious. Varnak's eyes lingered on the bodies of the fallen, his heart heavy with sorrow. Each death had been a painful blow, a reminder that they were always on the edge of something darker, something far more terrifying than anyone could imagine. But that was the reality of being a Deathworlder. The constant battle to survive, the endless struggle to protect others, even at the cost of their own lives. "Let's get out of here," Thorn said, his voice quiet, yet firm. "We've done all we can." Varnak nodded. He gave a final, long look at the cavern. The once shifting darkness was now nothing but a smoldering heap of energy, its power extinguished for good. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, this place had been the heart of a nightmare that could have destroyed everything. As the Deathworlders began to move, the journey to the surface felt like a long one. The weight of their fallen comrades was with them every step of the way, the pain of their loss pulling at their hearts. But Varnak knew there was no time to mourn, not yet. The battle was over, but the fight for the galaxy wasn't. They had just won a victory, but many more would come. There would always be another threat. There would always be more to protect. And when the galaxy cried out again, the Deathworlders would be ready. They finally emerged into the light, the sun breaking through the clouds, shining down on a world that was still alive. The air smelled fresh, untainted by the dark power that had once threatened to consume it. They had saved this planet, this one small corner of the galaxy, but there was more to do. Varnak stood tall, his shoulders squared with pride. He was a soldier, a protector, and his duty wasn't over yet. "Let's go home," he said, his voice firm. "We've earned it." As the Deathworlders made their way back to their transport, they couldn't help but glance back at the planet they had saved. There were no words to capture the weight of their victory, no way to describe the mixture of pride and sorrow that filled their hearts. But in the end, it didn't matter. They had answered the call. They had saved the galaxy. And when the universe called again, they would be ready. The Deathworlders would rise. Again and again, until the stars themselves faded from existence.